from TU Vienna to us. He's quite new, and so this is really exciting to have him here. And he's giving a talk towards serverless data exchange within federations. So we are very happy having you here and very excited to hear you talk.
Perfect, right in time.
Yeah, thank you a lot. Thank you very much for the quick introduction. We'll just switch to presenter mode here. Okay, so it seems that it's only my talk that separates us from a tapas bar, and so I will not make it too complicated nor too long. Just quickly, why am I here presenting this? Well, I'm assigned on a European project with TU Wien, together with my professor Sharon Tusto, who is also here with me. We wrote this paper together at TU Wien with TU Berlin and Politecnica di Milano. And it's an essential part of our project proposal. So I want to jump into what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So, well, we commonly know that data is regarded as, so to speak, the new oil in some sense, because it is a resource that is quite valuable, but also a crude resource in the sense of that it contains information that needs to be extracted by processes such as data science, for example. And even though that this resource to yourself may not play such a big role, somebody else can greatly need this data, and therefore we would advise to exchange data in order to improve its utility instead of letting it sink into the oblivion of data silos. One issue that might arise here at this point, because if you carelessly share data with topics such as the GDPR, a lawsuit is only a call away. And therefore, if the data actually contains such information, you cannot just simply share it and hope that there will not be consequences, because private information should stay private, of course. So one process that the data can undergo right here is that you actually transform the data, that you say, okay, what are certain patterns that I consider privacy violating? How should the data be transformed in order that it conforms to those requirements? But essentially this process introduces what we call data friction, which means it's an extra burden that actually impedes the data transfer, because if you know, okay, I have a set of requirements that my data must fulfill, one might drop out and say, okay, this is too much work for me. And essentially another problem that you might run into is that all customers that want to consume this data set actually might require a tailored copy of this data set. And to stick with oil, one might require gasoline, the other diesel. But if you don't know this in upfront and the customer comes here and says, yes, I want precisely this, you might be surprised and not support it. Also, essentially, this will result in a couple of duplicates of the data set. So I want to make this a little bit more precise with the following use case. In this following use case, we would have a study promoter that wants to conduct a joint study, which means basically that you take samples from different patients, from different data sets, join them together, evaluate them in order to extract some knowledge. Well, the scientific idea behind this, of course, is nice, but from a study promoter's perspective, this is quite cumbersome due to multiple reasons. One of them, for example, is that you have general norms such as the GDPR that impede the data transfer. And also maybe you might assume that, for example, in healthcare, you have a lot of standards of how data should be encoded. Nevertheless, you cannot assume that just because you have a European standard, South America, somebody else, you cannot automatically assume that all of them follow the standard. So also to transform data to, like, let's say, one standard format is also a problem. Another issue that you will face here is the manual negotiation of usage agreements. And it will surprise you, but according to our medical partner, most of them are still pen and paper, which means, okay, I put you here the contract, you sign it, and I may actually use this data. And essentially, what is required here is also a mechanism to discover these data sets, because in this case, I assume, of course, that I know who this data owns, but in case I don't know this, I require also a mechanism to discover this data set and also automatically agree on policies that must be respected when I consume this data. Okay, so how could such a solution look like from a studies promoter's perspective? In this case, we asked our medical partner, and this was the result we arrived together. So as you will see, you have, for example, here the study promoter who wants to conduct a study on, for example, blood samples with a certain pathology, with a certain age range. So what this study promoter does is it collects all of these requirements and asks the catalog, okay, these are my requirements, do you have any type of data sets that match these requirements? And in case we have so, we can then receive these data sets. Now what the study promoter then can do is that, okay, just because I know that the data exists, doesn't mean that we actually have the consent of these patients to participate. So that is also something native to the healthcare. And in this case, we would then, in the third step, query if actually those patients that are, for example, located in 3 different data sets would be committed to participate in this study. And they say, for example, yes, different amounts, but essentially the study promoter then knows how many patients would be committed to participate and can decide whether they actually want to hold the study. Subsequently, they could then request access from this hospital to this data, like those 3 hospitals, and then they would prepare the data according to the requirements, which would mean, okay, certain data format, and then the hospital would also attach policies of how this data should be used. And essentially, this data then goes back to the study promoter, who has now everything he wanted. Okay, so from a more general perspective, what is it that we envision at this point? It is that we, on one hand, what we saw, have an automatic matching of requirements from a provider and also from a consumer perspective, where one can provide the specifications for the study that I want to hold, for example, and may see all the data sets that actually match my requirements or that can be transformed to match them. This next step would then have the data is actually transformed according to these agreements. And what could also be very nice, if we already talk about what we wish ourselves here, would be that we have automatic provisioning for storage, but also for computing along this processing chain. And generally, what this would provide for data providers, but also for data consumers, is that for data providers, it greatly alleviates the burden of sharing the data, because they can rely that policies will be respected, and on the other hand, the data consumer knows according to the agreement that the data is prepared as intended. Okay, well, this is a big field, I would say, and like within this scope, there was 2 contributions that we, as a project, are currently working on, which is first of all the notation of federated data products. We'll quickly go through this later, which is basically a term that we borrow from data meshes, and then also to support the exchange of federated data products, the serverless data exchange. Okay. For now, I would like to go a bit into what a federated data product is. So as I just said, I suppose that some of you might know data products from data mesh, which is basically, I would say, rather a principle. It means that you separate the responsibilities of one's curating the products and providing it with policies, and on the other hand, having a technical team which is responsible for providing the infrastructure, for example, providing storage, but also for creating mechanisms to explore this data. So you would have on one hand domain experts that are responsible for providing usage policies, but on the other hand, you would have an infrastructure team that is in charge of providing the infrastructure. Also, far so good. The issue is that this is a concept that is mainly used within a single enterprise, because within the same enterprise you have multiple things that you can rely upon, because, for example, you don't have to ensure identities or have to care about which resources you are using. So as soon as you start to share these federated data products, you run into a couple of issues. Therefore, basically what providers and consumers would wish here is an underlying mechanism, an underlying platform that supports them within this data exchange. Okay, so for now I would like to talk a little bit more about the life cycle of such a federated data product, because this is basically what we will then also implement in the architecture. So how would such a life cycle look like? From the ingestion, from the onboarding until it is consumed, but also then disposed at the end. So for a federated data product, what we do in the very first step is that we persist the data in a certain location according, for example, to storage policies, but that we also have domain experts who are then in charge of supplying policies of how this data can actually be used. For example, compulsory privacy transformations that must be run. As a next step, we would then have publishing, which assumes that the data is already stored at a certain location, which then takes the data, the federated data product, and registers it in a federation-wide catalog. And what this catalog can, for example, support are queries that are customizable according to the catalog consumer, which means that each of those consumers can essentially have a personalizable, a customizable view of the data set, for example, in terms of records that can be accessed. Okay, so in the third step, as soon as we have the data product published in the catalog, what we can then do is that we, as seen before, query this catalog, encounter this data product, and agree on how this data should then be served. Within such agreements, you should then be able to supply constraints, for example, which transformations must be run, how long this data can be accessed, how often it can be accessed. All of those constraints should be possible to add within such an agreement. And essentially, this third step is concluded with all the parties signing the contract and having a copy of this contract. Okay, so the fourth step would then be to actually consume this data, where you would first have to run all compulsory operations, as I already said, for example, transformations on the data. And the second step here is that you would have to document all the interactions with the data set, because in case you're interested in data lineage to provide information of how that data was actually modified, for example, for an internal audit, this is what you require here. And nonetheless, it is also possible to optimize the processing in terms of moving the data to a specific location within a federation. Last step would then be to dispose of this product. Okay. Now that I've talked a little bit about what we understand under a federated data product, I would like to say a little bit about a serverless data exchange. Well, serverless, I am sure, is a principle that most of us have heard about. And in the context of serverless, there's a couple of terms that we are using. The first of them is a serverless function, which is basically a function that you can run on infrastructure that you right now not possess. And our idea is that we have all these sort of transformations that I was just talking about, and you can supply them as serverless functions so that you can then rely on the infrastructure to enforce them at a certain location. In this context, serverless processing would mean that I have certain serverless function and rely that it is at some place enforced. Another concept that we were thinking here in this context is the serverless data, because it's not only possible to relocate the processing itself of the data, but also to relocate the storage of the processing. So that you say, okay, in order to optimize my processing chain, I might not only put the processing on a stronger node, but I might also, for example, locate the data closer to the consumer. And this essentially is the architecture for serverless data exchange, which builds upon the life cycle for federated data products. And if you have a close look, we will see soon together that this builds upon the life cycle of federated data products that I just introduced to you. So the very first point would be that, for example, we have a data product for a certain data provider who uses storage that's provided by the control plane here, in this case. So whenever you think, okay, where is this certain resource or this storage coming from, usually it's the responsibility of the control plane, which is in charge of providing federation-wide resources. So in this case, we would then have data product, which is ingested, where we actually store the data within the federation. where domain experts may then supply privacy transformations or other types of policies to the data. And for example, these functions, these serverless functions, which contain privacy transformations, could then also be federated within a federation-wide function repository. So the next step, as we recall from the life cycle, would then be to register actually this data product within the federation-wide catalog here, which means by now the data is, the product is published and accessible to others. Next step would then be, okay, the data consumer here, as we recall before, it would have been, for example, the study promoter, who actually now wants to consume this data. So what do? They will browse the catalog in order to find data sets that actually meet their requirements specified as metadata, for example. And in case they find some data set that matches their expectations, they will then, what you see here is 3B, sign an agreement on how this data should then be provided. And within this agreement, for example, you can then again include transformations in the form of serverless functions. Okay, so far we have this agreement, and the data consumer can now supply this agreement to the catalog, who actually resolves the locations of where the data is located. In this case, this could be like either this one or those on the other side here. And it forwards the request to the data product, and now what happens is that in some place within the federation, this data must be transformed. Now there's multiple options, because like you can see on, for example, on the right side, that this can be on premises that are, for example, located at the provider side, but also on premises that the consumer has. Or imagining some case that you don't have any premises, or you say, okay, the ones that I have are not strong enough, you can also use some cloud services. Okay, possible issues that we see with this here. Well, so far we are very agnostic in terms of tools and technologies, although it is still under development. But we have to say that this is very dependent on the functions that the control plane and the trust plane fulfill. So as you just saw before, the control plane is everything that is in charge of providing resources, such as the storage, processing resources, but also federating the serverless functions so that they are available when they're actually executed. Trust plane, on the other hand, is very critical because it ensures the identities between the parties and that contracts that are signed are actually enforced. Okay, so to quickly summarize what I told you so far is that the motivation for developing this architecture is that the data sharing process itself is very impeded by constraints such as privacy, but also by semantics, because, for example, different data formats. Therefore, you would like to transform the data in order to meet those requirements. However, this introduces excessive data friction. So the solution from our side would be to actually specify the data as federated data products, where you will have domain experts that define the policies of how the data can be used by others in the form of serverless functions, either upfront or supplied them later on in agreements. And then, in order to actually access such a federated data product, you would make use of serverless data exchange, which is essentially supported by the control plane, which is in charge of providing the resources, but also by the trust plane, which is in charge of ensuring the identities of all those that want to access the data. And essentially, when you have an agreement of the data, the goal would then be that along the federation somewhere, the data is actually transformed ad hoc according to the policies that are attached to it. Although this can, of course, be optimized according to where you actually run these transformations. Okay, that was all from me so far. Thank you a lot.
So thank you very much, Boris. This actually concludes our scientific program for today, and we will meet again in an hour at the beach bar. If someone doesn't know where it is, just come here and I will explain the way to get there. Thank you.